Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Salam alaikum, and Ya Ali Madad to everybody on this critical conversation number 67. My name is Dr. Shireen Khuwaja, and I'm the academic coordinator for ITREB USA. I will be the moderator for today's critical conversation. This critical conversation series has been conceived as an ITREB USA initiative aimed at engaging the entire Jamaat, but with a focus on 18 to 40-year-olds. The series aims to explore the critical questions of our time within the context of our faith. Before we begin, I would like to read a land acknowledgement. Land acknowledgements are formal statements that seek to recognize and respect Indigenous peoples as original stewards of their land, and the enduring relationship that exists between Indigenous people and their traditional territories. We do this to express gratitude and appreciation to those whose territories we reside on, and to honor the Indigenous people who have been living with and caring for their lands from time immemorial. Recognizing them also means acknowledging the historical and ongoing genocide of Indigenous peoples and the ways in which we benefit from and perpetuate violence towards Indigenous peoples. Naming the original and current stewards of the land we live on the lands on which we live is the first step towards making reparations. I reside in Dallas, Texas, and I acknowledge that this area is the home of and traditional lands for many Indigenous peoples, including the Caddo, Wichita, Tawakoni, and Ki-Kapoi, as well as the tribes that may have lived here and roamed the area, including Comanche, Kiowa, and Apache. We believe the work we do in these sessions is part of our responsibility to acknowledge and address the ongoing harm to Indigenous people. It is part of our work towards a society that is more just, equitable, and in keeping with our ethics as Ismaili Muslims. Now, once again, before we move forward, I would also like to take a moment here to recognize the superstar behind the scenes here. This is not planned on the script, but I did want to go ahead and take a moment for this acknowledgement. As you know, this is the 67th critical conversation, which we are having today. It is a program that was developed in response to COVID, and the effort was to keep our community connected. Now, Farhana Hussaini, if I can just ask you to please, for a short moment, just if you can turn your video on. Well, time to embarrass you a second. Farhana Hussaini, as many of you know, is the mastermind behind the inception and continuity of these critical conversations. And it's a bittersweet day for us today because bitter in the sense that Farhana will not be sort of running the show behind the scenes. This is her last session. She has started off something great, and hopefully we'll be able to carry that forward under new leadership. But under her leadership, after 14 years, I believe, that Farhana is officially, not unofficially she'll always be connected, but in formal sense of the word, she'll be stepping away from this position. But it's also a very sweet moment for us because I don't want to look at the sad part about this. I want to look at the celebration of Farhana's leadership and what she's created over here. Under the worst of circumstances, she created a garden of beautiful flowers and kept us connected. And Farhana, this is a celebration of your leadership. It'll continue to be a legacy that you leave behind. Thank you for all the hard work that you've done and for keeping the young and the old of our Jamaat connected through conversations that matter to us, that hurt us in the right spot, and that we want to converse about. Moving forward then, our session today is entitled Justice and Equity, the work of Shi'a Imamat, where we would have a candid conversation about the concepts of justice and equity and how throughout history, these concepts have driven the work of the Shi'a Imamat. During this session, you will see a Q&A box where you can share additional questions and thoughts during the presentation. We will try to address as many questions submitted during today's talk as we go forward. With that, I'm honored to introduce to you our wonderful speakers for today's session. Dr. Gurdofarid Miskinzoda has been a personal teacher of mine, is the head of Shi'i Studies Unit in the Department of Academic Research and Publications of the Institute of Ismaili Studies in London. She also teaches aspects of Shi'i history and thought at the IIS. Dr. Miskinzoda received her BA in Oriental and African Studies in 1998 and her MA in Arabic Studies in 2000 from the Institute of Asian and African Countries of Moscow State University. Dr. Gurdofarid, Dr. Miskinzoda obtained her doctorate in the history of the Near and Middle East and Islam from SOAS, the University of London, in 2007. Most recently, in 2019, she obtained an MBA in Higher Education Management from the Institute of Education, University College London. Dr. Miskinzoda is a senior fellow of the Higher Education Academy in UK. Dr. Miskinzoda is also the co-editor with Dr. Farhad Daftari of the Study of Shi'i Islam, the History, Theology, and Law, published in London in 2014, and the author of Narratives of the Life of Muhammad, Redefining Sira Literature with the Routledge Publications. That's forthcoming. Dr. Miskinzoda was a member of ITREB UK from 2009 to 2012, and is currently a member of the AKF UK National Committee. Welcome, Dr. Miskinzoda. Such an honor to have you. Then also
it's an honor to be on the panel.
Yes, the honor is ours, Dr. Miskinzoda. Thank you. And so then also let me take a moment to introduce our second speaker for the day, and that's Dr. Shaykh Faiyaz Jaffer. Dr. Jaffer is the research scholar for the Islamic Center at New York University and an associate chaplain for the Center of Global and Spiritual Life at NYU. He holds a doctorate in education from New York University with a focus on the identity development of Shia youth in the United States. Pursuing the classical course of Islamic education, he studied in the seminary of Karbala, Iraq, one of the most prominent centers for Islamic learning. As a faith leader and social activist, Dr. Shaykh Faiyaz Jaffer has lectured at various universities, seminars, and workshops across the United States, Canada, Europe, East Africa, and the Middle East. As a highly sought-after lecturer and religious leader, he regularly leads prayer services and delivers sermons across North America. Due to the political and social climate, he has been making strides in the greater New York area by taking part in several interfaith seminars and discussions with the goal of increasing dialogue with faith leaders. In 2019, Dr. Jaffer co-founded Pillars of Peace, a nonprofit established in order to address a gap in appropriate services for survivors of domestic and gender-based violence from all backgrounds, and in particular with the Muslim community. In addition to his roles at NYU Islamic Center, Dr. Jaffer serves as the adjunct assistant professor of public service of NYU's Robert F. Wagner School of Public Service, where he teaches courses on Islamic law and Islamic spirituality, and his research has appeared in academic journals. Now, I feel like I've taken a lot of minutes with my voice, and I'd without further ado, I'd like to jump into this conversation. And as we start, I'd just like for us to note that the views of our speakers expressed during the course of this discussion are their own. Let's then turn to our conversation, Dr. Miskinzoda and Dr. Shaykh Faiyaz. Let me go ahead and kick us off with a question that is a bit more personal on your end. As we begin, we would love for our audience to get to know you a little bit more. What led you both to the field of Islamic studies, but more particularly the field of Shi'i studies? Dr. Shaykh Faiyaz, Jaffer, if we can start off with you, please.
Yeah, thank you again for your kind introduction, for having me as well. I think more than anything else, curiosity. I feel like that many people, they pursue higher education for a lot of unique goals, be they personal, be they familial, be they for the sake of serving community and whatnot. And all of these things are fine and they're all great. But I think that anyone who desires to kind of take a deeper dive into the religious studies, more specifically, they probably have some sense of curiosity, or at least I can speak for myself. I think from a fairly young age, maybe my latter years of high school and my early years of undergrad, was consistently drawn to like these very existential questions. Why am I here? What is my purpose? Who am I? Where am I going? Why did God create me? And these sorts of inquiries, which led me to pursue an undergraduate degree in religious studies, master's degree in Islamic studies, so on and so forth. But then more particularly with regards to Shi'i studies, we have this incredible legacy from the Prophet alayhi salam and his family, some of which we're going to extract and probably touch base on today. And I realized that they're this really incredible source of filling that gap and answering those most fundamental and existential questions to help me find that purpose of why I'm here. So on a personal note and on a personal level, I think it was this inner drive of curiosity that led me to religious studies more broadly, and specifically the Shi'i studies, just because of how incredible these teachers and guides that we have within our religious tradition have kind of motivated me or inspired me to fill that gap.
So thank you so much for this. It's already making me think about this idea of your existential questions. That's where it began from, and then why there is an underlying aspect to the justice piece here, of course. Dr. Miskinzoda.
Thank you. First of all, thank you to ITREB USA for this honor to be on this panel, and to Farhana Husseini for coming with this concept of critical conversations. I would also like to thank you, Dr. Shireen Khuwaja, for chairing this panel. I know the subject is not easy. And to my co-panelists, Dr. Shaykh Jaffer, and most importantly to our viewers and participants today. So I just say my thanks before I forget and get carried away with the topic. In terms of what led me to Islamic studies, it's a long story, which I want to cut short and say that towards the end of my high school, I planned to be a biologist. That's what I wanted to be. I was good in sciences. And then due to a life event, I got quite interested in why do people believe in God? Why do we have to perform rituals? So that's kind of issues. And the only way at that point in my life that I could engage with those questions was to go for Arabic studies, Arabic literature and language. And that's what I did when I joined my first university for my BA. That carried me away all the way to Moscow State University, where I finished my BA and MA in Arabic language and literature and wider Oriental studies. And then I ended up similar to you both, Farhana and Dr. Khuwaja, at the Institute of Ismaili Studies, where I engaged and kind of applied my Arabic and Persian studies background to studying wider humanities and Islamic studies. And it was there that I then got interested in the history of Islam and Near Middle East while I was studying with Professor Gerald Houting, Muslim history. And when I completed graduate program in Islamic studies and humanities, I then wanted to join these two passions and let's say these two aspects of my educational background, which is Arabic and Persian literature, and now Islamic studies, but then refocus myself, let's say, into history and historiography. So my doctoral studies was on the, as you mentioned, was on the biographies of the Prophet, Sirah as a genre. And that's basically combined my expertise, let's say, in literature and linguistics and textual and literary criticism with the study of history. And then while I was doing my PhD for a very long time, as it often happens, I had the opportunity of teaching several courses, and among them was a course on Shia Islam. And then I was a lecturer for that course at the School of Oriental and African Studies. And when I finished my doctorate and applied for a research associate position at the Institute of Ismaili Studies, this is what basically I was hired for, to work on our Shi'i strategy and moving towards wider Shi'i strategy. So that's basically my journey from, let's say, Arabic language and literature all the way to Shi'i studies.
And from your journey from biology, in fact.
Yeah, exactly. And coming from biology, let's say first.
Yes. Well, when I was working on my dissertation, one of the areas that was very self-searching type for me was this positionality of the researcher. So the fact that today we're talking about justice and equity is not coming out of nowhere. One can easily see why the topic of the day is embedded in your experience, in your expertise, in your research, and in your personal quest in that sense. Within this concept of justice and equity, which is a fundamental core to the history, doctrines, and foundation of Islam, from your research and study, how is justice framed in Islam? And let's start off with you on this one, Dr. Miskinzoda.
Okay, if you allow me, I want to, before I come to Islam itself, I want kind of to prepare the background for myself, to when I come to let's say the Islamic section itself, and in particular to the Shi'i section of our talk, that I have kind of a ground on which I can explain why I think things are the way they are. So I want to start with, if you allow me, with what is justice itself, and what is the relationship between justice and equity, or justice and equality, and why these two are always kind of paired with each other. You know, when we talk about justice, we always kind of assume that equity or equality somehow is related to that concept. So a concern for justice and equity is nothing new. Many ancient societies, cultures, religions have been concerned, in fact, deeply concerned with justice and its role in how they are organized. The religious tradition itself, the whole system of belief, the whole system of hierarchy, etc., essentially deals very often with concepts of justice and equity, even if it's within the religious context. And we know civilizations like the Greek, the Romans, the Indians, the Persians, the Chinese, all those ancient civilizations were very much concerned with these concepts. Professor Jaffer McCord, for example, talks very often about the Plato in the Republic about 2,000 years ago, who came up with one of the most influential accounts of the origins and nature of justice. And we all know that Plato came with two principles of justice. And first of these principles was that principles of justice can be seen as principles for the coordination and structuring of social interaction that would benefit all who are subject to them. Therefore, principles of justice deserve our mutual allegiance because they provide mutual advantages. So in a sense, if you want to be treated justly or equitably, you have to give the same to the other person. But so in a sense, principles of justice deserve our mutual allegiance because they provide mutual advantages. Yeah, if you want to be treated equitably, you have to do the same to someone else. Yeah, but just what these principles are might be different in different places and at different times as the circumstances in which we live change and what is in the mutual interest of everyone shifts or changes. And I want to park this point because when I come to the Shi'i doctrine and why justice is so central and why the prerogative and roles of the Imam are so central, this point will be very important. But I want to explore this a little bit here because justice might demand different things at different times. We have just came out of COVID. You know, what was just during lockdown is not just today. You know, during natural disasters, during wars, pandemics, etc., circumstances might change. And here, for me, the role of the Imam in the Shi'i tradition within the religious context becomes important. So, but there's Plato's second principle also, and that is at the core for me because it's very essential. If acting according to mutually advantageous principles is not merely a good idea, but is genuinely a matter of justice, then justice is each getting what is rightfully theirs and no one getting what is rightfully another's. That for me is the core. And when I go to the principles in Islam, that to me is then connected to the revelation, to the Quran, and some of the aspects that for me are important there. And I take them to mean that if something is just or rightfully mine, then someone cannot take it away from me. I want to bring the example of slavery here in the 19th century, which is an easy example because of how abhorrent slavery is. In the 19th century, those who were against slavery had different arguments. One would say that slavery is bad because abolishing slavery would bring overall happiness to everyone. The other would say that slavery is bad because I feel disgusted that someone can own someone else. And then there's another group that would say slavery is a violation of rights of the slaves as humans. And according to Plato's two principles, it's this third one that is most important, because what you're doing is you're taking away from slaves what is rightfully theirs as humans. Yeah, that they have the same rights as you as human beings to be free, to have their liberty and their right to life. And this is what you're taking from them. And when we look at the relationship between justice and equity and justice and equality, this is very complicated also, because in some questions of, for example, to deal with abortion, questions to do with taxation, questions to do with rights of people with disabilities, equality and justice become, in a sense, they have disagreements with each other. Because, for example, if you think that everyone should have the same rights, but then you're not giving people with disability extra support, or if you think that people with disability need extra support, but then you need it to give it to everyone, is that equitable indeed? So the relationship between those two terms, justice and equity, is not very straightforward. But do you want me to go now to the concept of justice on Islam, or do you want Sheikh Jaffer to come in? Or
yes, I mean, I would like for us to go to the concept of justice in Islam. One question, though, I would like to ask, as I feel maybe there are others on here, my colleagues, that might be sharing the same inquiry, and of course, the question is open to both of you, and that is that in the society we see that the notion of justice and equity evolves over time, as you identified. Is that the same, the evolution and the awakening towards this whole idea of rightful belonging? Is that something that's already core in the core definition of how justice is defined in Islam? What is rightfully belonging to someone? Is that there already, or is that also something that has evolved over time? And also, let me give you a background as to why there's several. Well, let me go ahead and let you answer, and then if needed, I'll bring in the example.
Okay, I think this is important, because just what the principle that those principles of justice might be will be different in different places at different times as the circumstances change and what is in the mutual interest of all people shifts. And I think that is important to know. In Islam, I think, to me, and this is why I kind of gave this long-winded introduction about justice, is for me, there's so many ayats and so many words in Islam, in the Quran, that refer to this concept of the word justice, the English, let's say, word justice. Words like adl, words like mizan, weights, words like haq, truth, and words like qist. But I think, and you could Google nowadays Quran for those words. But for me, there are two ayats, and those of us who are Ismailis would recognize those ayats quite quickly, because one of them was in the Golden Jubilee emblem and the other was in the Diamond Jubilee emblem. Those are, for me, that are kind of the core, the crux, against which I talk about justice and Islam. First is Surah 4 Al-Nisa ayat 1, and we all know that one. O mankind, be careful of your duty to your Lord, who created you from a single soul, and from it created its mate, and from them twain hath spread abroad a multiple or multitude of men and women. And this is the crux of justice in Islam for me, because it is innate in the revelation that we are created equal from a single soul, all human beings, not even man and woman, black and white, yellow and Greek or whatever. But I think everyone, all human beings, this is the bottom line. The second one is Surah 49 and Hujarat ayat 13. O humankind, indeed we created you male and female, and we made you diverse peoples and tribes so that you may come to know one another. Indeed, the noblest among you in the sight of Allah is the most pious. Indeed, Allah is all-knowing and all-knowing. Again, that for me is the background. I think what I won't separate at this point from these two ayats is then what happens in the Muslim history between the revelation of the Quran, the development of laws and rights and rituals, and their application. That is a different story, because that is a human engagement with the revelation, human understanding of this revelation. But that core, that that divine revelation itself that sets these two parameters for me is above everything else.
Thank you, Dr. Miskinzoda. I will ask Dr. Jaffer to please share your thoughts on the topic.
Yeah, for sure. And thank you, Dr. Miskinzoda, for your beautiful words. Maybe I'll just add one additional verse to that might help supplement the conversation. In the Quran, it's also mentioned, وَلَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي Adam, that we have honored all of the children of Adam, meaning that everyone has this existential right to be, at the very least. And I know in a lot of theological texts within Islamic tradition, maybe even more specifically within Shi'a tradition, there is this notion of justice of God within kind of these three dynamics. There is the first dynamic, what is known as the existential justice of God, adl at-takwini, where, God, he creates, we believe that God is the creator of the sun and the moon and the stars, the oceans, the rivers, that the fact that I'm created in this part of the world and not during the time of the Prophet Muhammad, or not during the time of Jesus or Moses, that this is all out of the justice of God, because he's putting us where we belong. And this is, and naturally it's out of his authority and out of his wisdom, which in itself is a manifestation of this idea of justice. And then sort of carrying that on, there is this notion as well as adl at-tashri'i, this legal justice of God. To Dr. Miskinzoda's point that she mentioned much more eloquently than I could, is that we recognize that in God's knowledge and God's wisdom, not speaking to the human application of law. Even in like the study of Islamic law, we differentiate between, God's law and our law, that we think we're doing it the right way and we try our best to do it the right way. And you find, people ask all the time, what's the opinion on this? And I tell them, okay, well, we have like 4,562 opinions on like this, like one item of whether we can eat this type of food or whatever it might be. That diversity of opinion is because everyone is striving to do the right thing. But foundationally and fundamentally, we believe that God's law is just, but in God's realm, right? And that which is revealed in the Quran and to the Prophet. And our job is naturally to illuminate that to the best of our capacity. And then the third, conversation that often gets engaged in matters of Islamic theology, particularly pertaining to God's justice, is what is known as adl al-jazai, or the sort of recompensatory nature of God's justice. So, Quranic verse that says that the one who does one good deed, they will be, returned that one good deed. They'll be rewarded that one good deed. The one who does one bad deed, they'll be punished for that one bad deed, and so on and so forth. And this all comes back to this idea that there is this notion of accountability and justice, equity, that reside in terms of our personal responsibility. Now, what happens if I was exposed, I was more knowledgeable? The popular question that many folks may ask is, what's going to happen to the person who was never exposed to God or was never exposed to Islam, right? Well, we believe that God is the all just. So God will judge them in accordance with their capability and capacity. I'm looking at for my own salvation, let alone for the salvation of other people. But I believe that, again, if we recognize and we submit to this God that is the king of this dominion, and submission to him in its entirety, then I also recognize that God holds everyone to account on very different lenses. But that being said, I'll go back to the first point that I made, and I'll pass it back to you, Dr. Khuwaja, which is that at the end of the day, undoubtedly, the human being and our existence to be is a manifestation of God's justice, as mentioned through various verses of the Quran, and is a conversation that's clearly been engaged and had for centuries, even pre-Islamic revelation. I think a core tenet of any religious community, any community of faith, and certainly any community striving to identify truth.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Dr. Jaffer. So one thing that's coming to my mind is of course the big question is, who is the decider of this justice, right? God, yes, when, you know, in the lay person's mind, who is not knowledgeable about the notion of justice and how it should be played out. A lot of the unjust that happens in the world results in oppression of the marginalized. As I will ask the formal question, but as I think I would like to, again, I would like to start with you, Dr. Jaffer, in the second question, and then I'd ask Dr. Miskinzoda to then come in. But in this question, if you could please also elaborate upon what does the Quran also say, and what does in the notion of justice within Islam, what is the guidance around oppression, those who oppress and those who are oppressed? What is the ask of them as folks who are receivers of injustice in that sense? But let me go ahead and articulate my question, sort of to allow the framing of this response, perhaps. That the Shia Imams throughout time have embedded action with their beliefs. And this question also came up in my mind because this question is about Imam Ali, with himself being a paragon of justice, and thus living an embodiment of this, not just a receiver of injustice, but also committed to the part about offering justice under his leadership. Can you explain what it means to live one's faith in that way, as someone who offers justice, but also so often is someone who is the receiver of injustice?
Yeah, that's a beautiful question and has a lot of unique complexity and nuance to it that could probably engage in a conversation for a long time. You know, and particularly if we were to sort of shine a little bit of light on the example of Imam Ali alayhi salam, with regards to someone, you know, who's an example in establishing systems of justice, as well as being someone, like you said, who is a sort of prototype of being oppressed as well. It's very, very unique. And the lessons that we can extract from his life and from his legacy are immense. You know, I would say that there are probably, you know, a couple of important takeaways from the life of Ali, perhaps in answering this question. And I'll go back to that, you know, very, very popular and maybe oft quoted letter that Ali writes to Malik al-Ashtar, which is quoted in many historical texts, but perhaps most famously known as letter 53 in Nahj al-Balagha. And in this really lengthy letter, we often quote one line, which is, "O Malik, people are of two types, either your brothers in faith or your equals in humanity." But really, it's this really, which is very, very powerful, but it's a very lengthy letter in which Ali writes to this companion confidant we had appointed as the governor of Egypt, Malik ibn Harith al-Ashtar, advising him about how to lead. Again, from someone who is now leader, Ali being the head of state, the caliph of the Muslim world for 4.5 years or so, but also someone who had gone through, you know, decades worth of oppression prior to that. So it has this sort of very unique complexity to it. For those, just as a quick parenthesis to open up, Malik al-Ashtar, who this letter was written to, actually never assumed the power, never assumed the authority. He was actually killed by Muawiyah before arriving in Egypt and assuming the position of the governor of Egypt. So there's three really sort of quotes that I wanted to take away from here, and then I'll pass it to Dr. Miskinzoda. Firstly, in the very beginning of this letter, Imam Ali alayhi salam, he writes, "This is what God's servant Ali Amir al-Mu'mineen has ordered Malik ibn Harith al-Ashtar in his instrument of appointment for him when he made him the governor of Egypt." So the very first statement is starting with this notion of God centricity. He states, this is what God's servant Ali is writing or dictating to Malik. meaning that he does not say that this is what the leader of the Muslim world, this is what the boss says to the employee, right? It's not through the system of hierarchy. It's reminding us and Malik, and perhaps humbling Ali in his own eyes, as great and as magnificent as he was, to say that I am God's servant firstly and foremostly, you know? And I think that's very, very powerful. It teaches us a lesson sort of in humility and in recognition of duty and responsibility. Number two is he says in a later part of the letter, he says, "O Malik, be it known that I am sending you as governor to a country which in the past has experienced both just and unjust rule. Men will scrutinize your actions with a searching eye, even as you used to scrutinize the actions of those who have come before you. And they will speak of you even as you spoke of them." You know, when we are not in a position of power and we're not in a position of authority, or we're not in a position of leadership, the easiest thing to do is criticize someone who is in that position. So he says that, remember, the same way that you used to criticize others, just get ready for that critique. So again, in other words, recognize and remember this sort of notion of humility. And then thirdly, he says in a latter part of the letter, he says, and really he extracts that quotation from a Quranic verse. He says, "Do justice for God and do justice towards the people and against yourself," meaning hold yourself accountable as well. And then later he says, "And know that if you are just to others, then act equitably to them in the same way that you want God to be equitable to you. Be merciful to others in the same way you want God to be merciful to you. Be kind in the same way you want God to be kind to you," so on and so forth. So again, this notion of God centricity and so on and so forth. I say all of this and sort of reflect upon these, you know, lines from this very lengthy letter, which I encourage everyone to read and reflect upon if they have a moment. And I know it's also been posted in the chat. To go back to the point that when we are in a position of authority, as well as when we are in a position of detriment, or in a position of or sort of an oppressed state, just to remind ourselves that God is always and ever present. You know, even in light of challenges that, you know, young Muslims face in this country, as we, you know, at least in the United States. Dr. Miskinzoda, I know you're across the Atlantic, but you know, where we are close to another, you know, cycle in our elections, where undoubtedly there's going to be rhetoric targeting Muslim community, an increase in Islamophobia and xenophobia targeting minority groups and communities and so on and so forth. It's to remember that we do the best that we can for God's sake, because we have a duty and responsibility to combat, to speak out, to do what we can. But at the end of the day, also to remember that we have to put God in the equation, because I don't believe that our religious tradition teaches us that social justice or social advocacy can truly be manifested or illuminated or actualized if we do not include God in the picture. And I think that's a really important and unique lesson that we learn from Ali during the course of his life, is that no matter what the circumstance, he always knew that the root and the foundation was to God.
Thank you, Dr. Jaffer. And Dr. Miskinzoda, this sort of reminds me and takes me back to your example of slavery in a formal sense. I guess the slavery still stays alive in informal sense in so many ways. Systemic slavery is out there as well. But this whole idea of how this accountability of God and what God understands, our understanding of God, of what God means by what's been given to us as guidance, seems to be a problem time and time again, because even with slavery, that's been the issue, that people thought that they had the right to own people, that it was a divine guide, or there was a divine dominion over other folks, other human beings. And so interesting segue, but Dr. Miskinzoda, your thoughts on this, please.
Well, I'll build on two points that Shaykh Jaffer has mentioned in his response, but I'll just start with what you say. That's exactly what it is, and that's why I separated the Quran, the revelation, from this practical implementation. And that's one point that Shaykh Jaffer just raised, is that and this fascinated always me as a scholar of Islam, is how sophisticated the thinking and how open the scholars of early centuries of Islam have been, because they recognize these complexities. Yeah, they recognize how insufficient the intellect of a human being is, for example, to understand God's revelation and to make sure that his law is implemented as best as one could. And that's why, as mentioned earlier, that in the Muslim tradition, obviously there's a distinction between Sharia and fiqh. Yeah, Sharia is the divine law, and fiqh is human engagement with that law. And you will often see the rhetoric, especially in Western countries, unfortunately, is that whenever they talk about law in Islam, they conflate these two things. Very often they talk about fiqh, yet they use the term Sharia. And that's what kind of it kind of brings chaos to this understanding. The other point that I wanted to highlight is that the whole concept of adl, justice, is core in Islam in relation to the theological, let's say, the theological system, but also in the way of how a ruler or the imam have to behave, both within political context and within the religious context. In that, therefore, and I'm again going to start with a very long-winded explanation, so that my main point becomes easier to make, is that the term adl etymologically is found both as substantive and as adjective, with meanings that in fact do not exactly correspond. And as substantive, in a sense that it has a separate and independent existence, adl means justice. Yeah, but an adala is demanded, for example, and expected of a ruler. And in the Shi'i tradition, the imam as a ruler is called al-sultan al-adil, the just ruler, because that's his prerogative. And also it is more complex in the Shi'i tradition, because the imam is also the lawgiver, the one that explains and is supposed to help the implementation of the law. As an adjective, adl, in the sense of the word naming an attribute of a noun, it means just. So it's both just and justice, and it's well balanced, and therefore applies to both beings and to things. And that's what makes it more complex. And I want to highlight that complexity by bringing another ayah to the discussion, because in Al-An'am 6:115, it is even the revelation is termed as just. That the God's revelation itself, it says, the word of your Lord has been perfected in truth and in justice. These are two important aspects, truth and justice. None can change his word, and he is the all-hearing and all-knowing. Even the revelation itself is characterized as just, that it has been conceived, or it has been revealed, or it indeed is being perfected in justice. Therefore, for example, and this is the sophistication of the earlier Muslim thinkers that always leaves me in awe. For example, Ibn Rushd, the famous Averroes, observed that there has never been agreement on a definition of the term justice. And he used to say that there are many definitions, but for me, for example, the definition that is proposed by Al-Mawardi is most interesting. because he says that adala is the quality of adl, of justice, and this is described as a state of moral and religious perfection. So that leads me to another aspect in the Muslim tradition where adala or adl is very much connected with moral and religious perfection. Remember that earlier surah that I mentioned, 49 ayah 13, talk that you are all equal and the best of you is the one who is most pious. That's the only characteristic that makes you better than anyone, any other human being. Nothing else, not your color, not your money, not what country are you from, not what kind of education are you having, etc., 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 but that you have to be the most pious, the most observing. So I think that for me, and that's why it becomes more complex in the Shi'i tradition, because adl is one of the principles of faith. Yeah, like in the Mu'tazili tradition, in the Shi'i tradition, adl, the justice of God, constitutes one of the 5 fundamental principles of faith, because God is just, and in his justice, he needs to decree, or he must decree what is just, and he must fulfill his promises. So that's how important that concept is in the Muslim, and in particular in the Shi'i tradition.
So Dr. Miskinzoda, just a quick question. In response to this idea of, yes, there are many understandings of justice. The one who enforces justice is different from the one who receives justice. Yeah. Another facet of faith is intellect, as we discuss a lot within the Shi'i tradition in Islam. Could you perhaps maybe shed some light, some connection? Is there a connection between the role of intellect and the concept of justice in Shi'i Islam?
Yeah, in Shi'i Islam it is. It is also important, and I'm sure Shaykh Jaffer has more to say on this. But adl becomes the principle of faith, because, and also one of the characteristics of the Imam, as I mentioned, is that he is a Sultan al-Adil, that he has to bring adala. There is a relationship between the Imam and the Murid, yeah, which is based on love and justice, etc., etc. But in the Muslim tradition, generally, for example, adala is very much demanded of a ruler who is not adil, and Sheikh Jaffer just referred to that important letter, in which if you are a ruler, you have to be just to your subjects. Yeah, that was the whole point. The whole task of scholars in the Sunni tradition was to make sure that the rulers are just towards their subjects. And in the Imami 12er tradition also, that in the period of Ghaiba, it's the role of the mujtahids and the marja to make sure that the murids of the Imam are treated with justice, that they are protected. And that's the most important, as you say, that this relationship between the person who is in authority, whether he is a ruler or someone else, and the relation and the person who over him there is some kind of authority, that there is always this what do you say, with this the expectation is that they are treated with justice. And a sultan, for example, who is not adil, is very often very quickly portrayed as fasid, which is the worst thing that the sultan could be portrayed as, that he is unjust. He's an unjust ruler.
Now, just thank you for attending that side question, Dr. Miskinzoda. And Dr. Jaffer, I'd like to invite you to respond and add your thoughts to this, and with another sort of layer, if I may add to it, particularly with your experience. We live in the United States of America, where the ruler, the rule is not Islam, the ruler is not Muslim. How then does practice of Shi'i notion of justice become even further complicated for Muslims who live in a country where the ruler is not Muslim, and definitely not even Shia Muslim, right? So this, to come to then terms on an agreement on what the notion of justice means in a faith tradition and how it gets lived out in the land which we live, certainly gets even more complicated and nuanced. So in that sense, this is an institutional issue that gets created, and the urgency, the reconciling of the lack of urgency begins to take place. Both in the sense of how do we reconcile a lack of urgency within institutions in the land on which we live that may not be ruled by a Muslim ruler, as well as within Islam, the Imamat and religious leadership, please.
Yeah, it's a very practical question on a lot of levels, right? And I think, it goes back to the way that we're defining these terms in the first place. If it's about putting things where they belong and giving them their right due, then if I'm walking on the street with my two children who are 8 and 6, and they see trash on the floor, their question is always, Baba, like, why did someone put trash on the floor and not in the garbage can? I say, okay, well, if the trash deserves to be in the trash can and not on the floor, then like our job is to pick it up and put it in the trash can, right? It suffices that our responsibility is to put things where they belong if other people are not doing it. We believe in our religious tradition, as Dr. Miskinzoda said, right, the work of the Shi'i Imamate is to help facilitate that, is to create that environment. And within the 12er tradition, the Imam is in ghaiba, he is not present with us. And like Dr. Miskinzoda said, the aspiration is that religious leadership is set to create that climate of justice. But it does not mean that they're going to be coming from the east to the west or different parts of the world and picking up trash and putting it in the trash can. It means that their responsibility, like we learned from the Imams, I think in a statement from Jaffer as-Sadiq, he states, alayna al-usul wa alaykum al-furu', that up to us is to give you the tools, the principles, and up to you is to figure out how to put that all together, so to say. So many, at least, jurists within the 12er tradition, they often quote this within, classes on Islamic jurisprudence and so on and so forth, as if to say that our responsibility when we don't know what God's law, that, revelation truly means, is to do the best that we can. But even if we extend that reality toward practice, in this part of the world, when you don't have Muslim leadership, when you don't have Shi'i leadership, when we don't, so on and so forth, we don't live in that environment. I think it's about utilizing the tools that we have been given via religious tradition, via sacred text, and saying, okay, how can I implement this within my own context? Knowing that my job is to do the best that I can, right? Utilizing the tools that I have been given in order to determine, or in order to fulfill my responsibility. I think a lot of people, particularly, many young people, they get sort of turned off from religion or from religious community because they always wonder, where's the work? Like, we don't see the effort, we don't see the work on the street, It's
Yes.
such a common thread. And, I work on a college campus, I work with, 18, 19-year-old students all day long. And I always tell them, like, why are you not doing the work then,
Yeah.
Why are you always pushing off blame and saying, well, this should be the imam's responsibility, this should be the community center's responsibility, this should be the X and Y and Z's responsibility? If we know what our religious duty is, we're only being complacent and contributing to that. If justice is putting things where they need to go, then pick up the trash and put it in the trash can. Like I always tell my children, instead of waiting for someone else to do it.
Yeah. Hey, Dr. Jaffer, your passion is palpable here.
I appreciate that.
So thank you for that beautiful articulation and just bringing the listeners on this critical conversation now into the picture with this practical taking over the role of justice if justice is not happening from where it's supposed to come from, in that sense. Let me just transition us then to a quote by Imam Ali and build my next question over it. And I think the quote will be shared for everybody's viewing on the chat as well, and I'll read it aloud as well. So Imam Ali is often raised as a symbol of justice and equity in action, both for others and for oneself. And he has famously said that struggling against the soul through knowledge, such as the mark of the intellect. The strongest people are those who are strongest against their own souls. Truly, one who fights his own soul in obedience to God and does not sin against him has the rank of the righteous martyr in God's eyes. The ultimate battle is that of a man against his own soul. He who knows his soul fights it. No jihad is more excellent than the jihad of the soul. To both of you, but let's start off with Dr. Miskinzoda. What does it mean to battle for one's soul versus against one's soul? How is this a form of justice?
I think it brings now, I think I didn't answer your question about aql. So here I can answer it actually. So I can't escape it. You are very right. I think aql, intellect, is very much in the Shi'i tradition at the core. Even in the legal tradition, it's one of the usul al-fiqh. It's one of the principles of jurisprudence. Actually, that's what distinguishes the Shi'i usul al-fiqh from the, let's say, from the established, how we know the Sunni principles of law. And in general, in the Shi'i tradition, this at least theoretically, if not practically, this also always demand that you need to use your intellect, and you need to use to work on your spiritual, this kind of what we know in the study of Shi'a Islam, but as Ismailis, for example, what we know from our everyday life is this batin and this zahir, the inner and the outer, that the two have to come together, but that it is you with your own understanding and with your own intellect that needs to make those decisions, and that needs to make that search. Of course, in the Shi'i tradition, then there's the ta'lim, the teaching of the imam that comes to fore, is that the imam is the guide, and that the imam is the teacher that will help you to not only nurture your zahir life, let's say, but your batin, or we can also put it in terms of deen in dunya, not only your dunya, your material life, but also your religious life. I talked about two aspects of adl, for example, the substantive and meaning, and the adjective, just adl as a substantive, as an adjective. And in fact, in the Shi'i tradition, in both these meanings and senses, the term justice and the term, this idea of, the role of the imam is directly related to the conception of the doctrine of imamat, the nature and characteristics of the imam, and ultimately to the function and prerogatives of the imam in the Shi'i tradition. And it is the role of the imam to nurture the murid in his spiritual search, but it is the murid who basically, the person who has to do the work. As you just beautifully read from that quote, is that you first need to start with that battle with your own soul, with the search, and in that sense, I don't want to go into the doctrine of ta'lim too much, but the third principle of the concept of ta'lim in the post-Alamid period in the Nizari tradition is that mutual search of a murid for someone who will guide them in their batini and dahiri life, and the availability of that teacher, and they will finally meet each other, basically. Yeah, that's where it is. That search that begins with the murid, with the human being, that search for peace, for kind of search of, in a sense, controlling your ego, controlling your, and then finally it leads to that recognition of the Imam of the time, and then submission to him, and then he then becomes your guide, basically, in leading them. And that's what you start with Imam Ali as the Imam par excellence, and then you have the chain of the Imams, in the 12th tradition, until the Imam Mahdi's occultation, but in the other traditions, in particular in the Ismaili tradition, up to the Imam of the time, in that sense. So I think, for me, that's the important thing, that the person himself has to begin that search, that fight, yeah, let's say, and then the Imam is there to facilitate that teaching, that guidance.
I apologize. Thank you, Dr. Miskinzoda. Dr. Jaffer?
Just one point maybe to add to that. In the Arabic language, we see the opposite of adl as dhulm, or this notion of maybe oppression, as it's often translated. And you'll find this as a common theme in many of the hadith literature narrated by the Prophet, or many of the supplications narrated by many of the early Shi'a Imams, be it Ali in his famous supplication that he narrates to Kumail, Dua Kumail, as it's often known as, or in many of the supplications as narrated by Ali Zain al-Abidin, the grandson of Ali, the great-grandson of the Prophet, the fourth Shi'a Imam, and then as well as founded within a lot of the other literature as this notion of dhulm of oneself, oppression of oneself, balamtu nafsi, as Ali says in many of his very sort of devotional supplications. Oh my Lord, I'm oppressing myself. Consistently in a state to demonstrate his humility in front of God. Of course, we believe that Ali does not have sin, or does not commit sin, but at the end of the day, there is this notion that I am lowering myself in front of you, O God. And I think that demonstrates this idea that in reality, and I'll sort of say this more clearly, that we cannot be someone who establishes justice in the streets or in our community or even within our own homes until we have established this justice within our own self. And that we're working toward establishing justice within our own self by piety, by good-naturedness, by good character, by wisdom, by knowledge, by all of these things, by the most sublime and perfect qualities that every human being is seeking. And at the same time, that helps inform how we act in the street. So we see this example of the Prophet Muhammad, or we see this example of Ali alayhi salam as par excellence, like Dr. Miskinzoda said, which is undoubtedly a reality, but the reason why he was able to do what he did was because it was already reconciled internally. The heart was already had already been cleansed and already been purified. It was where it needs to be. Again, if we sort of run with that understanding of justice, the heart is where it needs to be. So his actions are going to also be where they need to be consistently toward creating that justice in community and society. So one cannot establish this notion of adl until they've removed dhulm individually, and then thereafter in society. First, the removal of darkness, and then that establishment of light.
Incredible. It was wonderful between responses from both of you. It's become almost a theme as we begin to come towards the questions from the audience that we will step into now, that there's a really beautiful balance of the theoretical understanding and then the practical encouragement, so to speak, about what does it mean to not just understand the concept, within our deen, but also how to practice adl as a living part of our deen. So if it is all right with both panelists, I'd like to jump into the question and answers from the audience at this point. We've received some good questions, and I will start from the first one I have here is, in Imam Ali's letter, there was a distinction drawn between, oh, I apologize. Let me first actually, let me go ahead and go into the questions and answers. And then I would like to also share just the main themes that have sort of come up from your talk already. I think this will allow for more questions and more nuance to the notes that I would like to share. In Imam Ali's letter, there was a distinction drawn between treating the virtuous and vicious equally. This has been especially evident in the recent Supreme Court rulings in the US, which continue to reinforce historic inequities under the guise of treating everyone equally without consideration of race, religion, or sexual orientation in their marginalization. As Muslims, how should we understand this? And more importantly, how should we respond? Dr. Jaffer, let's start off with you on this.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for the individual who asked the question. I think it's important to read the letter also of Ali alayhi salam to Malik al-Ashtar in a historical context. And it would be sort of not appropriate toward applying every reality of that to our current context. I was talking to a few members of my community just this past Thursday at an event, and they were telling me about what lecture series that they want to hear from me next. I do a weekly lecture in my community, and I had some folks who were from the UK, for instance, who happened to be visiting New York at summertime, and their desire to talk about certain subject matters were very, very different than the conversations that the young people from New York wanted to have. And I thought it was really, really unique because everyone's coming in with their own unique baggage, right? They're coming in with their own cultural context from where they are, where they're situated, how they frame and how we define a term like social justice, right? This super attractive term. I just came off a class that I've been teaching in the summer here at NYU called Social Justice on the American College Campus. So conversations around affirmative action are undoubtedly central to the tenant. But in the first class, which is a 3-hour lecture, I'm just going through all of the different definitions of social justice as defined by American scholars, in the last several centuries, let alone different opinions of how that's defined in other parts of the world. So I would say that, going back to the question really, really quickly, how we understand Ali's statement in that is not through this lens of color blindness that we speak to or that often people utilize today, which is obviously very problematic. But rather telling Malik that if they were of someone prior to, today judge them equitably because because all of that which took place prior to has been reconciled. So if someone has already been held to account, obviously we believe in accountability from head of state, from the imam to the murid, as Dr. Miskinzoda mentioned, then undoubtedly there has to be some sense of societal and communal reconciliation or accountability, which undoubtedly is the foundation of our, of our religious practice. With regards to our responsibility in light of this, I think number one, firstly and foremostly, is to have a good understanding and awareness and nuance of what is taking place. And then again, fulfilling our duties and our tasks and making a difference in terms of putting things where they belong to the best of our capability and capacity. My job as instructor in the School of Education at NYU is to teach grad students these different definitions of social justice and get them to understand the nuance around, again, very unfortunate, in my opinion, in my estimation, verdict on affirmative action. But it starts with having an awareness and a knowledge base of truly what's taking place and transpiring. And then advocacy work thereafter really depends on where individuals are situated or what their respective positionality is. I would hate to give sort of a black and white on that one.
Mm-hmm. And Dr. Miskinzoda, of course, you're welcome to add your thoughts to this question. I also see the next question seems very fit for an earlier comment you made. So allow me to just read that out to you, and then you're welcome to make comments on the earlier question as well if you wish. The next question here listed for me is, how do we understand the necessity to bring justice and equity to those who live in an Islamic society where the interpretation of the faith is in the hands of those that use injustice to preserve their position in society?
I won't make further comments on the previous questions. I think Shaykh Jaffer answered it perfectly. This question is very complex. It's difficult because what happens very often is that religious context and political and geopolitical contexts kind of either merge or have to coexist with each other. Obviously, in those countries that the question refers to, the religious interpretations of the laws, of the norms, of justice, etc., is very much bound by that religion, that particular interpretation of Islam. And this is exactly why I separated those two right from the beginning, because if you have the main principles in terms of justice and equality, for me, in the Quran, which is the word of God, which is above everything else, in those three ayats that I've mentioned, then everything that comes out of it is the human interpretation, human understanding, human implementation of that. And I think in each of the beauty of Islam is that in any of the traditions that currently exist, let's say major traditions, whether it's Sunni, whether it's any form of the any form of the Shi'i traditions, if those in charge, let's say, whether they are the ulama, whether they are the maraji, whether it's the da'i mutlaq of the Gurdofarid tradition, whether it's the imam of the time of the Nizari tradition, if in earnestly they interpreted and understood, and as I said, with this whole concept of justice, but all other concepts, looked at the context of the time and adopted those to those times, then obviously we would have not been in cases what the question refers to. But I think despite that, again, as a scholar of Islam, I'm always in awe of the earlier interpretations of the revelation, of the laws, etc., where you, for example, in terms of the rights of women in Islam, Islam was so much ahead of any society at large, let alone any religious tradition. It is even in the early centuries, that in Islam, women had rights to property and inheritance. I mean, in the West, they didn't have those rights even up to the mid 20th century in some cases. In Islam, marriage is a social contract. It's a social contract. It's a social union in which both the man and the woman have responsibilities and rights. A woman can petition for divorce. I mean, come on, where's that heard of? The women couldn't divorce in Western countries up until like 50 years ago, even. And rights to leadership. Women had right to be leaders of a state. So in a sense, those are, and I'm not being very kind of, I'm not, let's say, putting pink glasses over issues, but what I'm saying that those in the early period when scholars and when religious leaders were more flexible, let's say, and had a more wider understanding of how these revelation and how these laws can be interpreted, you had a different situation. And a lot of what this question refers to in the countries that we could, we suspect would be on the list is not about Islam. And I'm not defending Islam here in no way. It's to do with the geopolitical games and geopolitical context, which are basically not allowing that society to have it otherwise, let's say, and I will leave it at that at the moment.
It's for all the critiques that we are constantly staying in the world of, Dr. Miskinzoda, thank you for ending us on that note. Your thoughts actually reminded me of the fact that Pakistan, a Muslim country, had a woman prime minister before, Benazir Bhutto, before any Western countries had so certainly there are areas to also be noted where justice has taken place. So of course we can do better about, like Shaykh Faiyaz said, to create the climate of justice in that sense. So as I wrap up, let me just go ahead and share just about 3 points. I like to take away about 3 bullet points from any intellectually rigorous conversations that we have and as I do that, I want to first begin by thanking both Dr. Shaykh Faiyaz Jaffer and Dr. Gurdofarid Miskinzoda for your valuable reflections over this topic that we could spend hours and days and weeks and months and years on discussing. The 3 points that really stuck out to me is that the evolution of the notion of justice in Islam is just like the evolution of justice that happens within societies, that it is the human interaction with God's divine guidance that is there, and awareness to that sort of gives me an empowerment to be able to step away and say that I get it, that I'm following some rules that are given to me, but those rules have an element of human error in there. Then I need to engage with the law itself also to see what more meaning can I make out of it. But it is an evolution, and it comes with time and necessity of time and space, and that context also matters when it comes to this. The second point that I am taking away is putting things where they belong, a theme that kept coming up with the notion of justice. And I really appreciated this simple example of somebody didn't put the trash in the trash bucket. Well, let me do it. And it's a really simple but powerful way of using the tools that are given by the Shia Islam on justice at a very, very, very simple level to then be able to think about it on a more complex level is how do I then go about advocating and putting things where they belong. And there are ways of systemic advocacies that can happen. And then the third thing that I'm taking away for myself is this idea of reconciling inner justice, that removing darkness first before cultivating light. And this idea of adl, aql, and zulm, and that there's a very much of an interconnected dialogue that's happening constantly every single moment of our lives. And there's a beautiful shairi, a couplet that's something that goes in the sense of every day is Karbala. For a Muslim, for a faithful person, every day and every moment is a Karbala, in the sense that we're always fighting for justice, that it's not a place where we arrive at, but rather a place that we continue to strive for. And within that striving, the role of Imam and the relationship with the Imam, and us taking the step of search, but then his guidance and his providing the inner guidance and inner light to then be able to cultivate the external justice and external light. Work that continues. Thank you, speakers, for sharing your time with us today, and thank you, audience, for for joining us today. Hopefully, this is just the start of this particular type of this topic, critical conversation, and that you'll continue this conversation beyond this hour and a half that we've spent together today. It's such a treat, as I hope it was for all of you who are watching. And before you head out, a couple of announcements. In the chat, you will find resources that are recommended by the speaker. So there is a reference to Justice and Remembrance by Dr. Raza Shah Kazmi. This is the book. Imam Ali's full letter to Malik al-Ashtar. And there's a link that would be provided for that. The Sacred Foundations for Justice in Islam, the teachings of Ali ibn Abi Talib, and edited by M.A. Lakhani. And I'd like to add one more, and that is the prayer, Dua al-Qumail, Imam Ali's Dua al-Qumail, that was also mentioned. So for the recording of this conversation, the past conversations, please visit the Facets of Faith page on the Ismaili USA. Please look out for more information on the Ismaili USA webpage and social media pages for young adult conversations this week. And our next critical conversations, because COVID could be gone, but we're not going anywhere. And please take the survey at the end of the session that will pop up on your screen as you leave. Once again, a heartfelt gratitude to Sheikh Jaffer and Dr. Miskinzoda, and a very special thanks to Farhana for leading us into critical conversations from the very beginning. Lots of prayers and barakah for all of you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Khuwaja, for chairing this panel so beautifully, and to Farhana and to Sheikh Jaffer and to all that participated today.
Likewise, thank you all so much, and thank you again for having me, and thank you, Dr. Khuwaja, as well.
Yeah, thank you all.